Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Man, does it feel good to be able to say that again. If you've been wondering why I wasn't uploading for the past few weeks, or if you didn't notice at all, this channel was struck with a bunch of copyright strikes back on October 31st. It was devastating to say the least, but I went through the proper channels and contested the claims, and thankfully, I'm back in action. I can't thank you all enough for sticking with me during this time. There were a lot of crazy chapters in that period, so I decided to talk about 1097 through 1099 as briefly as I could. If you're only interested in a certain chapter, feel free to skip ahead. Throughout this breakdown, I'll be referencing this timeline that I've compiled of the various events going on around the world that are relevant to this flashback. If you'd like to see this in full or follow along with it, it's linked in the description. As a quick recap, Kuma was born 47 years ago in Sorbet, and at the age of 4 was enslaved by the Celestial Dragons. The God Valley incident took place 38 years ago when Kuma was 9 years old. And that brings us to 30 years ago at the start of chapter 1097 titled Ginny, where we find Kuma as a 17-year-old pastor in Sorbet. The limitations of the pawpaw fruit are revealed as we learn that the pain that Kuma pushes out of people must be accepted by someone or else it will eventually return to its original owner. Now this is very interesting considering the bubble containing Kuma's memories in the paw room. As we'll come to find out, this bubble has been around for nearly 4 years. It's unknown how this bubble has stayed in this room without any interference for so long. Perhaps Vegapunk was able to use his technology to contain it, but I do wonder if the real reason that Vegapunk didn't want Bonnie to touch the bubble wasn't just because he didn't want her to find out about the truth behind Kuma's actions, but because if the bubble was accepted by someone else, then it would disappear forever. Could Vegapunk have been storing Kuma's memories in preparation for the day that they would eventually return to their original owner, thus restoring the now mindless Kuma to his original conscious state? I don't know if Oda's going to go this direction for sure, but it would be very tragic to have Bonnie inadvertently ruin Kuma's only chance at restoring himself. We flash forward a bit to 25 years ago when Ginny proposes to Kuma, but Kuma turns the offer down in fear of his Buccaneer blood causing more problems for the ones he loves. It's at this time that we're formally introduced to Gyogyo. Now, as we discussed in the last chapter's breakdown, this guy is actually part of Bonnie's crew and was one of the kids that picked on Kuma as a child in the previous chapter. Gyogyo seems to be a fisherman at this time, and his name is a nod to this with Gyo meaning fish in Japanese. We have yet to get the name of the other guy with the slicked up hair. He was also in the last chapter as a kid. Later in this chapter, we get another friend of Ginny and Kuma with his triangular head and a small afro. Gyogyo, along with both of these men, were all present as Bonnie's crew upon her introduction during the Sabaody arc. 3 years later, at 22 years ago, Kuma, Ginny, and their friends were all imprisoned after trying to fight back against King Bokori's tyranny. But Dragon and Ivankov arrive and free the group, putting a temporary end to Bokori's policies, and we see the Revolutionary Army formed as we were told by Vegapunk earlier in this arc. Now, there's been some speculation on who some of these other characters in the group could be. There is a woman who somewhat resembles Bello Betty, but Betty would be 12 years old at this time, so this seems unlikely. Beside her is a masked man with a cap that features a bird symbol or a pin. This could be a young Karasu, who would be 25 years old at the time, but this is all just conjecture. Besides, Ginny is a man who may look like Sabo, but funny enough, this would be the very year that Sabo was born, so it's definitely not him. We move ahead 8 years, bringing us to 14 years ago, with Ginny stationed in an unnamed country. I'll talk more about this when we talk about chapter 1100. She's the captain of the Eastern Forces, a position held in the present day by Bello Betty, and we even see Betty obtain this rank later in the flashback. Of course, she is unfortunately abducted by a mysterious figure who we'll learn is a Celestial Dragon, which brings us to chapter 1098, Bonnie's birth. This chapter picks back up approximately 2 years since the last chapter as we're told by the narrator, but we can also piece this together from Ivankov's statement about having a ship full of injured people from the kingdom of Goa. This looks to be taking place not too long after the burning of Grey Terminal, when the Revolutionary Army rescued many of the inhabitants and Dragon salvaged a young Sabo after he was attacked by a Celestial Dragon. All this took place 12 years ago, and at this moment in the flashback, Kuma fuels his rage over Ginny's abduction by assisting in a rebellion in the South Blue nation of Tumi. Of note, it's implied that Kuma may have used his pawpaw powers to arrive at Tumi, since he mentions to Dragon afterwards that he'll be taking a ship back since he is tired. This would mean traveling from the East Blue to the South Blue. I bring this up because this travel doesn't necessarily discount the idea of Kuma being unable to cross the red line, as speculated from him crashing into it earlier in this arc. So far, all of the travel via Kuma's powers has been done either within the same ocean or between lateral oceans, such as Paradise in the East Blue or the East Blue and the South Blue, for example. We learned that Ginny was abducted by a celestial dragon and was forced into marriage, which is obviously a euphemism at best for the atrocities that she suffered. It appears she grew ill with the fatal disease that would be diagnosed as Sapphire Scale, but managed to return to Sorbet in her final moments with her child, Bonnie. Now, all of this is extremely tragic, and it becomes even more so when you consider that one of Bonnie's first scenes in the series was with her preventing Zoro from cutting down the celestial dragon Saint Charlos, who had just forced a woman on the street of Sabaudi into marriage and shot her fiancé. Bonnie wouldn't have known at the time, but her birth was an echo of that exact tragedy. There has, of course, been a lot of speculation on who the celestial dragon that took Ginny that day was. The idea that it was actually St. J. Garcia Saturn himself was floated, with the idea that Sapphire Scale could be a disease lost to time, as most doctors were completely unaware of it, and the one that did know had not seen it much in recent years. This would work with the idea that Saturn and the Elders may be even older than they look, as they have not aged throughout the decades that we've seen them in the series. There was also some connection between Sapphire being the gemstone associated with the planet Saturn in our real world, and while this idea has not necessarily been ruled out just yet, it doesn't seem to be the route that the story is going. I don't think it's actually needed to put a face to the person who started Kuma, Bonnie, and Ginny on these tragic paths. Kuma returns to Sorbet and buries Ginny while vowing to raise Bonnie as his own, and we get a good look at the inside of the church that Kuma lived in, and of note is this cross with the sun at the intersection. We know from the previous chapters that the Buccaneers held the sun god Nika in high regard in their beliefs, and the sun symbol here is another instance of the various cultures of the One Piece world having some sun-inspired symbol as part of their iconography and worship. This one here is quite interesting though, as it's the only one so far that combines it with traditional Christian-inspired imagery. Not only that, the graves that are used are marked with cross-shaped tombstones. Now, I have some working theories on the various religions and belief systems in the world of One Piece, and I've been putting together a video talking about this in depth that I hope to be able to share with you all at some point. The Buccaneers' religion is absolutely fascinating, as Bonnie eventually got her hands on a book that mentions Sky Islands and potentially even Fishman Island as well. You can see that this book is actually the Bible that Kuma would carry around with him pre-time skip. These various locations all having been mentioned in this Bible is very interesting, as both these cultures have exhibited sun worship in some form, with the Fishmen hoping to be able to live under the sun again at some point, and some Sky Islanders believing in the sun god explicitly. Well, that was technically the Shandians who were displaced from Jaya hundreds of years ago, but recall that the Shandians, Skypians, and Birkins all originated from the moon, as we saw in Annelle's cover story. Also of note, Bonnie as a small child somewhat resembles her depiction as a kid in the SBS. During this montage of Kuma raising Bonnie and carrying out his duties as a revolutionary, we get a brief glimpse of Sabo training with Kuma. While this is the first time we've gotten such a scene in the manga proper, the anime actually depicted Sabo training with Kuma back in episode 737. All of this comes to a stop though with the realization that Bonnie has shown signs of the same disease that killed Ginny, which prompts Kuma to leave the Revolutionary Army. This period of Kuma's life took place between 12 and 7 years ago, and we move forward to see a 5-year-old Bonnie chasing out some village kids who are teasing her for her condition. They call her a vampire and hold up a cross to fend her off, and this is somewhat interesting because it suggests that the mythology of vampires exists in the world of One Piece. The video game One Piece Unlimited World Red featured the non-canon Bat Fruit model vampire, which not only allowed the user to become a vampire, but coincidentally also had age-related abilities that let the user become young by draining other people's life force, leaving the victims in an elderly, withered state. The fruit and the game, of course, are not canon, but there's some fun coincidences going on with Bonnie not being able to be in the sun and having age-related abilities as well. This also reminds me that we still don't know what Stussy's devil fruit powers actually are, as she has also vampire-like wings and was shown sucking blood from victims. This presumably allows her to maintain her youthful appearance, seeing as how she was the first successful clone created by Mads, modeled after Miss Buckingham Stussy, who has clearly aged over the decades. Kuma reassures Bonnie and tells her that her face stones are actually jewels and bolsters her confidence. Now, earlier in this arc, we thought that her name of Jewelry Bonnie was a reference to her devil fruit, allowing her to age people down by removing jewels representing time from their body, but it seems this is more likely the origin of the name. You'll notice that Bonnie in the present day has a piercing right where the initial appearance of the sapphire scales were, and in a similar vein, Kuma asks Bonnie about the places she'd like to visit when cured, revealing that this is the origin of Kuma's iconic line, "If you were to go on a trip, where would you want to go?" It's at this point that Bonnie is formally diagnosed with sapphire scales, and during the montage of Kuma trying to find doctors to cure her, one of them mentioned that it wasn't white lead disease. Recall that this is the ailment that Law's hometown of Flevin suffered from. Sapphire Scale seems to be a new disease for us as readers, but there have been plenty of similar life-threatening skin conditions in the story, such as 5-day disease that Nami was struck with after Little Garden, the tree fever that plagued Jaya and Shandia 400 years ago, as well as the unnamed condition that caused Yorki's death that was said to have potentially been contracted from the jungle, much like where the 5-day disease and tree fever both come from. Interestingly, both the 5-day disease and tree fever were diseases that were around hundreds of years ago, just like Sapphire Scale is suggested to be from older times as well. I don't know if there's anything going on here explicitly, but there's somewhat of a trend of these kinds of diseases throughout the series. Now, there's of course the tragic irony of Kuma and Bonnie believing in Nika the sun god, despite Bonnie being unable to walk under the sun herself. This creates another parallel for Kuma as someone who is trying to be a hero like Nika, as he devotes his entire life to curing Bonnie so that she can live under the sun. Bonnie mishears the conversation between Kuma and the doctor and mistakes her 5 years left with 5 more years until she's cured on her 10th birthday, which would be the year that the series starts off on at the end of chapter 1. I guess this is as good a time as any to address the revelation that Bonnie is actually 12 years old in the present day. Now, I've talked about this topic and the problems with it at length in a previous video. You can check that out if you're interested. In that video, as well as in my chapter 1095 breakdown, I suggest that there's a lot of hints that her actual true age is younger than she appears, while offering ways for the character to actually be an adult. My personal favorite theory to solve this problem was by making her a clone of the original Bonnie, who passed away from the Sapphire Scale, as we learned from Germa that clones can be brought to physical and mental maturation in a much shorter time span than the regular humans can. But here we are, because it did not pan out. The chapter comes to a close, skipping ahead 1 more year, bringing us to 6 years prior to present day. King Bakori is up to his tyrannical tactics once again, and we get chapter 1099, Pacifist. We find the southern half of Sorbet ablaze by Bakori's forces, and learn that this tactic was inspired by a kingdom far in the east. This is of course in reference to Goa Kingdom, when the Great Terminal was burned with the intent of getting rid of all of the people deemed less than desirable in preparation for the arrival of the celestial dragon, Saint Jalmak. That took place 6 years prior to where we currently are in this flashback, and recall that Kuma was present there with the Revolutionary Army, so seeing this tragedy befall his own country enrages him to no end. Kuma makes his way to Bakori, and this exchange reminds me a lot of Luffy's final bout with Walpole, with both kings warning of the consequences of hitting a king. Kuma ultimately ousts Bakori, resulting in the solo revolution of Sorbet Kingdom. Now over at Mary Joa, St. J. Garcia Saturn is informed of the changes in leadership in Sorbet by someone who seems to be wearing a marine jacket, although it's lacking the iconic writing of justice on the back, so this could be a different figure altogether. Of note, there was a holy knight on God Valley that bore a similar silhouette with a pronounced collar and what may be horns or hair that is spiked up. Honestly, it bears a lot of resemblance to Foxy, but we're getting a little carried away with this. Whoever this is, I'm interested in finding out more. We learn that Kuma has now become the king of Sorbet, even if only in name, after the people of the kingdom pleaded for him to be the new ruler. Kuma is not the biggest fan of this, however, and insists that Bulldog is the one making the decisions, and even hands the title over to him officially later in the chapter. Now, Bulldog was the ruler of Sorbet from 2 generations ago. It's unknown how Bakori took the throne or if he has any relation to Bulldog at all, but that's likely irrelevant. Now, we may have actually seen Bulldog in the present day during the reverie, as some believe that this older man sitting next to King Taco is actually him. This would of course be 6 years after his appearance in the flashback, but it would work with him having been given the throne back after Kuma leaves. Not only that, it actually would work to explain why Queen Dowager Connie was so readily accepted at the reverie by the guards if Bulldog's family was still in power, since Connie is Bulldog's mother. And yes, we finally get an explanation of who Connie actually is after all of these years. Recall that Bonnie assumed the appearance of Connie using her devil fruit powers back during the Reverie arc to sneak in and find Kuma. Ever since then, we had been left to wonder if Bonnie herself was actually pretending to be a former queen this whole time, or if Connie even existed. In this chapter, we finally learned that she was just mimicking the appearance of the Queen Dowager through the use of her devil fruit powers. Connie would end up being a big part of Bonnie's life as her caretaker, and Bonnie's pre-time skip outfit would even be inspired by Connie's appearance, such as with the style of hat she wore. More on this later. While Bonnie's fruit is formally named here, we actually had gotten its name for the first time in Volume 107's SBS, which was released in Japan just a few weeks before this chapter. There's a lot to talk about with Bonnie's devil fruit, so let's just get into it. Firstly, how did she get it? For most characters, we just assume that they came across the devil fruit at some point in time and ate it, but this case is peculiar. You'll remember that Bonnie had been forced to live inside the church her entire life, as making contact with any natural light would worsen her condition, meaning the devil fruit would have had to have been brought to her unknowingly at some point. This was likely the case as we had seen her in Volume 64's SPS, a young Bonnie surrounded with various food, and among them several fruits. Her appearance here more so matches her appearance before she was 5 years old, as we saw her in 1098, as her hair is shorter and she lacks the sapphire scales on her cheek, but it is fun to consider that one of the fruits she was given at some point was ultimately the age fruit. Now I know some people like to imagine that Bonnie manifested the fruit, since she's been wanting to grow to the age of 10 so she can be cured and travel the world with Kuma, and they may cite Vegapunk's theory of devil fruits being born from people's desires. I feel that many people may have taken this idea to be literal, as it was presented that way in various translations, but it seems to be more figurative if anything. It seems people desired various things and devil fruits were created to satisfy those needs, and even then, Vegapunk himself considers this a theory. Plus, we know Bonnie could not have just created the age fruit purely out of her desire to grow old, since we see in this chapter that it was listed in a devil fruit encyclopedia and thus existed at some point prior. And as a real quick sidebar, this is another instance of a devil fruit encyclopedia being referenced in the series. The first mention of such a book was by Blackbeard during his battle with Ace, when we learned that there existed a book about devil fruits and their appearances. Not too long after, we would learn more about this book in Volume 45's SPS, and Sanji would reveal that he studied a devil fruit encyclopedia as a child during the Thriller Bark arc, and we would see this in his flashback during the Whole Cake Island arc much later. There seems to exist various kinds of devil fruits records, as suggested by Vegapunk when he explained the gum fruit was not found in even the oldest ones earlier in this arc. Later, when Sabo was relaying the result of his mission to Ivankov and Dragon, Ivankov referred to one of the abilities of the Op fruit in a book labeled Genesis, which may or may not be a devil fruit encyclopedia in and of itself, but back to Bonnie's fruit. While I don't think she spawned this devil fruit purely out of her desire to grow older, I do think there may be something related to her desires at play. We know that Zoan devil fruits have a will of their own, and that the gum fruits seem to have been actively evading the hands of the world government. What if this is also somewhat true of other kinds of devil fruits? Blackbeard seems to think that his dark fruit chose him, and as far as we know, that one is a Logia. And while I used to think that this was just him making up excuses for why he had to kill Thatch, what if there's some truth to this? What if devil fruits are attracted to people who on some metaphysical level match the desires and mentality that the fruit embodies? We know that devil fruits require some sort of mental synchronization from their user in order to awaken, as suggested by Kaido, so there's already something at play here with devil fruits caring about the user's mental state to some extent. This could also work to explain why we see so many people throughout the series whose personalities in one way or another embody their devil fruits. In this context, Bonnie has been desiring to grow older, and so the fruit may have somehow made its way to her. Now, she seems to have gotten these abilities fairly recently at this point in the flashback, as she hadn't realized she had transformed at all. That said, she quickly gets some sort of control over her abilities as she's able to mimic Connie's elderly appearance. It may just be a coincidence that she resembles Connie here, but we've seen that her powers in the present day can transform people into alternate future versions of themselves, so this could just be her aging herself with Connie in mind. We do have some precedent of devil fruit users transforming by visualizing things with their imagination, so this could apply here as well. I also wonder if devil fruits manifest in specific ways depending on their user. The representation of age as jewels come to mind. We see Kuma is pinned for all of the destruction Bokori brought to Sorbet, and this is where his epithet of the Tyrant originates from, having been first revealed all the way back during the Thriller Bark arc. This misinformation is what the world took for fact, as we saw earlier in this arc with Jinbei's understanding of Kuma's history. There, he believed Kuma to have been an awful tyrant who was ousted by the people of Sorbet, succumbed to piracy, and then was captured by the Navy before agreeing to their human weapon project. After this flashback, however, we know the whole truth. Kuma takes out Bokori once again, as well as the fleet of ships he summoned, and was given a bounty that over time grew to the 296 million figure that we saw back during the Jaya arc upon introduction. Now, interestingly, Bonnie seems to have learned that Kuma became a pirate, and this somewhat creates an inconsistency with this old line from her on Sabaody when she expresses some disdain or surprise at Zoro, a pirate, being so willing to help out a random civilian. This is a bit odd when she knows that Kuma is such a kind and charitable person despite being a pirate himself. And I bring this up not to poke fun at Oda, but rather to show that he doesn't plan every single thing down to the tiniest of details. He's an excellent writer and is great at making various things connect seamlessly, like the rest of Bonnie and Kuma's relationship for example, but some things may fall through. He likely had some vague idea in mind for the two characters, as there are some distinct things we can look back at, like Bonnie not being shown interacting with Kizaru, Sentomaru, or any pacifista on Sabaody, or her crying over what we now know to be Kuma when she was watching the Marineford War. Anyways, Kuma searches far and wide for a cure to Bonnie's sapphire scales, and you probably noticed that the places we see are actually the places that he would end up sending the Straw Hats back on Sabaody. We see him visit the Birdie Kingdom and speak to its people, including Shamba. This makes a lot of sense as the tribe was actually known for its advanced technology and medicine. He passes by the Muggy Kingdom on Gloom Island, a country torn by war up until just a few years before Kuma would visit. Mihawk may have made his home on the island by this time. Kuma then visits Baltimore, the birthplace of Dr. Vegapunk, who he would end up meeting later in the chapter. He also passes by Tequila Wolf, still under construction of course, as well as the artificial sky island of Waderia where he meets Haridas, and he even visits the Boyne Archipelago where he meets Heracles. At some point, he even encounters Abdullah and Jeet, who were after his bounty. You'll recall that these two are part of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet under Ideo's pirate crew alongside Blue Gilly, and it's interesting to learn that they are still bounty hunters at this point, meaning they have not yet attacked the world government just yet. Ultimately, Kuma runs into the Revolutionary Army and we see a younger Bello Betty, Morley, and Gambo. Betty asks for Kuma's grace in becoming the captain of the Eastern Forces. It's unknown if Morley was the captain of the Western Forces at this point, but we do know from Volume 91's SBS that Morley joined the Revolutionary Army fairly recently. It's unknown if Lindeberg is the captain of the Southern Forces at this point either, since Gambo would be the vice captain in present day. Either way, Dragon tells Kuma about Vegapunk, and we learn that Vegapunk is transferring to a new lab after a recent incident, which is of course in reference to Caesar Clown blowing up Punk Hazard. This brings us to 4 years prior to the present day in this flashback, meaning all of the events in this chapter before this point was between 6 and 4 years ago. Kuma reunites with Bonnie and they visit the Naval Science Division's Laboratory 8, which would eventually become Egghead. This makes good on Bonnie's line earlier in this arc of having visited the island back when it was just a normal lab. It is interesting to learn that there are at least 6 other labs aside from this and Punk Hazard. We see Vegapunk from 4 years ago, and you'll notice that he's wearing the same outfit he was shown in on his first hint of a depiction with the striped shirt and gloves. This angle that he's depicted in here also really works to show how accurate the silhouette we saw of him on Punk Hazard actually was as well. Vegapunk explains that he can cure Bonnie using technology that has been kept from the public, stem cells. Now, Mads was originally disbanded for meddling with bloodline elements research, so I can understand the government not wanting this to be publicly available out of hesitation. We know Vegapunk would be continuing this research in the present day with the organelles we saw in the lab earlier in the arc. You'll also notice that the room that they are having this conversation in is the same room we saw in the brief flashback earlier in the arc between the two. However, that flashback is taking place later on as Vegapunk's head has been replaced with the antenna, implying that Punk Records has been constructed. Also of note, in that flashback you'll see Kuma's arms are bandaged up, indicating that his weaponization is already underway, since we know from Doflamingo at Marineford that Kuma's arms were the first things to be replaced. Vegapunk sleazily coerces Kuma into becoming a test subject for Vegapunk's human weapons project in exchange for curing Bonnie, and calms Kuma's concerns by telling him that these clones will be used for good. And so, Vegapunk would end up creating the Pacifista and eventually the Seraphim using Kuma's Buccaneer blood, which explains why the Seraphim are so large. However, the lab looks to be bugged as Saturn is listening in on this conversation via Black Transponder Snail, the snail used for wiretapping, and begins to concoct his own plans for Kuma. I really do like this juxtaposition of Kuma and Saturn here in this final page, with Kuma being called a saint by Vegapunk for his selflessness, while Saturn is a saint only in name and title. This then brings us to what we've all been waiting for, chapter 1100. Thank you, Bonnie. We move forward in time ever so slightly, long enough for Saturn to have sent Admiral Kizaru over to the island. He's still wearing a fedora at this point in time 4 years ago. He seems to have some affinity for headwear, as he was always portrayed with something on his head up until 2 years ago when the series started. He wore a beanie or a skull cap when he first enlisted 32 years ago through when he met Vegapunk in Santa Mario, and then started wearing a standard marine cap 27 years ago as we saw him before the Ed War. At some point, he started rocking the fedora as we first saw him with this look as early as 15 years ago. The Marines are here, of course, to make sure Saturn's orders are carried out. Outside the lab is a 29-year-old Diaz Drake. While Drake is a captain of Sword in present day playing the role of a pirate, it seems he was still a regular Marine 4 years ago. This actually provides a lot of context to several of his lines and interactions from Sabaody, ranging from his exchanges with Kizaru as well as the fact that he knew about the Marines' human weapons project. He was there when it was first arranged. Back inside, Saturn explains the conditions that Kuma must adhere to in order for Vegapunk to save Bonnie, and the first one is that Kuma must become one of the 7 warlords of the sea. We find out that a fledgling Ace took out a warlord recently, leaving a spot in the group. Recall that Ace started out his journey 3 years prior to Luffy, so that means Ace started his pirate career a year before this point in this flashback. During that time, Ace formed the Spade Pirates and was offered a position among the 7 warlords 4 years ago. It's possible that this offer may have been the result of him taking down the warlord that occupied this position. This new revelation is quite fun, as it adds a lot to our understanding of the world. For example, we have solid confirmation that there were always 7 warlords as far back as 4 years ago. But actually, we can even go further back, as King Riku specifically mentions the existence of the 7 warlords 10 years ago. And of course, all of the pre-time skip warlords didn't join at the same time, because we have someone like Crocodile, for example, who joined at least 20 or so years ago according to Volume 78. There could have been several former warlords across the decades that we don't know anything about. Now the question is, who could that former warlord be? Maybe this is a character we've seen in some capacity in the series, but has yet to be disclosed to us as readers that they were a former warlord. That's possible. However, I wonder if this former warlord would have made sense as the mysterious man with the burn scar. First mentioned toward the end of the Wano arc, Burn Scar was speculated to have been a government affiliate, and of course, being taken down by Ace and his Flame Fruit would definitely leave them with some burn wounds. But not only that, it's very interesting that Kid and Law both seemed aware of this person's existence, while Luffy had no clue. Recall that around 4 years ago when Ace visited Wano, Ace mentions other up-and-coming pirates who have been making a name for themselves, and among that list includes both Kid and Law. If these two were already on their pirate journeys by that point, they would more than likely be familiar with that warlord and the developments surrounding him. Just a thought. Anyways, Saturn demands Kuma give up his body as a human weapon as well as relinquishing his mind and autonomy. This enrages Vegapunk, and he mentions that the government has been unable to control the other warlords very well, something we've seen throughout the series, but it seems that this was going on back then as well. This also adds a bit more context to Moria's line upon his meeting with Kuma on Thriller Bark about how Kuma is the only warlord to obey the government. This exchange is reminiscent of the dialogue Bonnie recalled back in 1094 when she attacked Saturn, but it's not one-to-one, so I'm curious if we'll see that play out in this flashback at some point. Kuma, being the saint he is, accepts these conditions without hesitation, and much to everyone's shock. Vegapunk explains the estimated timeline for both Bonnie and Kuma's procedures, with Bonnie needing about 6 months for the scales and another year until she can be outside, which would mean she would be completely cured around 2.5 years ago, or half a year before the start of the series. Meanwhile, Kuma's procedure would take at minimum 2 years, which lines up very well with when we know Kuma's operation was complete, as Doflamingo told us it was just before the Marineford War. But this does bring up an interesting question, as Saturn says Bonnie will be freed when Kuma has fully lost his will. If Doflamingo's claim back on Marineford was true, then there would have been no need for the world government to have needed Bonnie back during the post-war arc when Blackbeard captured her in exchange for some battleships from the Marines. Of course, Akainu's lines here could just be in reference to when she first escaped the government, and it being all over now could be about how Kuma has already lost his free will. We actually got this exchange continued earlier in this arc, and Akainu could also simply have captured her for her pirating, but I just wanted to touch on this briefly in case there is some revelation where we find out that Kuma hasn't fully lost his consciousness by that point. With the deal agreed upon, Vegapunk gets to work, and we see him express his frustrations with being unable to keep up with all of the things that he needs to do. This was first disclosed by CP0 toward the start of this arc when the idea of satellites were being explained to Lucci. Vegapunk says he needs someone to help write out his ideas, a task that we would see done by Edison in the present day, as well as needing to eat and use the bathroom, tasks relegated to York. He also expresses his anger over being so busy, a quote-unquote task that would be done by Atlas. It's interesting though that Vegapunk says he wishes there were 5 more of him, when there are 6 satellites in present day. Now, he does express the desire to create his dream weapon, something that could end up referring to Lilith, who out of all the satellites seems to have the greatest affinity for weaponry, but that leaves Pythagoras and Shaka unaccounted for. I wonder if there's any significance to this or if I'm just thinking about it too much, but it would be a fun twist if one of the satellites wasn't actually intended to exist. We get a montage of the 6 months that Kuma and Bonnie spent with Vegapunk, Kizaru, and Sentomaru while Bonnie was being cured. Kuma is hooked up to a machine that somewhat resembles the machine we saw Kuma attached to when Doflamingo was explaining the operation back during Marineford. Bonnie draws a picture of Kuma that Kuma would end up using as his Jolly Roger when he becomes a warlord, and we also see the lab begin its transformation into the egghead that we know today, with the first structures being built. You'll recognize one of them as one of the few rocket-shaped buildings, as well as the giant bottle-like structure that contains the clouds which would eventually hold up the labo phase. All of these materials are being brought in via Umit's cargo ships. Umit was first introduced during the Whole Cake Island arc as one of the Underworld Emperors, and he is a shipping magnate. With this, we have the inclusion of 4 out of 6 Underworld Emperors in this very arc, with Stussy and Morgans being in the main story, Dufeld being referenced in the Germa 66 cover story, and now Umit in this flashback. I wonder when we'll get to see Drug Peklo and Giberson next. It's during the 6-month period that the group begins to forge a bond, which explains why Kizaru was so uncomfortable with having to harm Bonnie. The group even dances to the rhythm of the Drums of Liberation. This of course raises some questions about Kizaru, such as how he feels about Kuma, or whether or not this has enough impact on him to eventually sway him toward helping Luffy. We'll just have to see. It also makes me wonder if Vegapunk had been aware of Nika before this point, or if it was his time with Kuma and Bonnie that sparked this interest. Afterwards, Bonnie is allowed to return to Sorbet, where she reunites with Gyogyo and the villagers. Connie offers to take care of Bonnie, but we're introduced to a new character, Alpha, who steps in. Alpha is a CP8 agent undercover as a nurse. CP8 was first explicitly referenced earlier in this arc. She bears a striking resemblance to Khalifa, both in terms of appearance and name, but of course Khalifa would have been undercover as part of CP9's mission at this point in time. Alpha could be Khalifa's relative, however, as we know Khalifa's father, Lasky, was also a CP9 operative. I'll note that Connie's outfit here very much resembles Bonnie's pre-time skip outfit, with the fur jacket and the hat. This could even be how Bonnie would end up sneaking out of the government's confinement, by posing as Connie as she did during the Reverie arc. After all, Khalifa easily mistook Monster Chopper for Nami, and perhaps Alpha is just as gullible. With Bonnie left on Sorbet, Kuma began his work under the government as a warlord, and we see the rest of the warlords of the time react. Doflamingo expresses some interest in Kuma, perhaps identifying with him as a fellow tyrant. It should be noted both Kuma and Doflamingo were introduced in the same chapter, and he seemed to be privy of Kuma's circumstances. Meanwhile, Crocodile is more concerned with their rainmaking ship, the Downpour, which they use to destabilize the political environment as well as the literal environment of Alabasta. Mihawk seems to have just taken out some enemy pirates while in his coffin boat, and meanwhile, Kobe and Alvida, along with some of their crewmates, are reacting to the news as well. Recall that Kobe joined 2 years before the start of the series. We see Ace, Jinbei, Blackbeard, and Whitebeard all together, suggesting that Ace became a Whitebeard pirate at least 3.5 years ago. Hancock is also unconcerned with this news, while Gloriosa is stressing the importance of information, just like she was during the Amazon Lily arc. We also see Moria express interest in Kuma's abilities, something that he would have learned of by the time of the encounter in Thriller Bark. Interestingly though, is the only warlord here whose face is obscured. I wonder if there's something to this, or if this is just a way to show his lazy demeanor as we saw before. The Revolutionary Army is of course in disbelief as well, with Koala, Hack, and Sabo surprised. We start to close the chapter with Kuma writing a letter to Bonnie and looking for places to take her when she becomes 10 years old. Kuma's ship is very cute, with the Jolly Roger featuring Bonnie's drawing, and the ship itself being designed after Kuma's appearance, with the bear ears in the back and the bottom of the ship being patterned after Kuma's hat. The ship also features several religious elements such as the cross, and maybe even recreating the church. He hands off the letter to a Newsku. This may be the first time we've seen regular mail delivered by Newsku in the series proper, though we've known about the service as far back as Volume 88 in the SBS. Kuma gets new orders from the government, and they ask about his location, and to everyone's surprise, he's in the East Blue, but specifically Windmill Village, Luffy's hometown. Now, there's a ton of possibilities for this. Of course, the obvious thought is if Kuma is there to do something to Luffy. The connection between Kuma believing in Nika and Luffy having eaten the fruit by this point comes to mind. Luffy at this point would be around 15 or 16 years old roughly. He starts his journey at the age of 17, and this is taking place at most 1.5 years before that. Personally, I don't know how I'd feel about the world government having already been aware that Luffy ate the fruit, so sending Kuma to handle that would be kind of odd for me. We actually don't know for certain that the government sent him here in the first place, since they ask about his location and specifically says that he has new orders. Windmill Village could just be one of the places that he was scouting for Bonnie. There's also a chance that Kuma is in the East Blue looking for the last place that Ginny was before she was abducted, possibly as a form of closure. Recall that she was the captain of the Eastern Forces, so she was likely stationed somewhere in the East Blue, and the island she was undisclosed, possibly for this sort of reason. There's also something to be said with how Kuma has been shown to be so familiar with Luffy. For example, during the Thriller Bark arc, Kuma wondered if Ace was Luffy's brother, despite this not having yet been revealed to the world. And during Sabaody, he ended up saving Luffy and his friends based on a connection that he had with the Straw Hats as a member of the Revolutionary Army, which likely had to do with Dragon. But how would he have known that Dragon was Luffy's father? Recall that not even Ivankov was aware of this, and when Eva pressed Dragon about his family, Dragon told him to mind his own business, suggesting that Dragon doesn't like disclosing personal matters. If for some reason Kuma does end up meeting Luffy here, or at the very least seeing Luffy, then it may add even more significance to Kuma's final words to Luffy in Sabaody of never seeing him again. We found out that this was actually in reference to Kuma losing his free will and mind, but could it actually have also meant Kuma had met Luffy on several occasions before, and this was the final time? Either way, we'll know very soon, as there is another chapter this week. It seems we may be back to the 3 chapters in a break schedule that we used to have, so that's exciting. Of course, we are close to the holidays with the New Year break, so it may be changing in the coming weeks, but I'll be here breaking the chapters down as soon as they come out. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far into the video. I know this was a longer one, but there were 4 chapters to talk about, and I really did want to cover all of them. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm super glad to be back, and I can't wait to get into everything once again. I have so many ideas, and we barely are getting started. If you're not yet subscribed, I really would appreciate it if you do. It really helps the channel grow, especially now that we've been gone for about a month. Take care, and I hope to see you soon.